the worst plague outbreak in history. It's the stuff of legend, killing millions across 3 continents. But what really happened during the Black Death? How did it spread? Why does it still matter today? Between 1347 and 1351, an estimated 75 to 200 million people died from the plague, which was caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis. As far as we can tell, the plague originated in Central Asia, where it infected rodents, including rats that lived on or near human settlements. The disease then spread along trade routes, first to Crimea and then to Sicily and the rest of Europe. Plague bacteria were most commonly transmitted to humans via flea bites, but it could also be spread through direct contact with infected animals or by inhaling the bacteria. So it wasn't a respecter of persons. Anyone who came into contact with an infected rat or flea or person could get sick. By the end of 1348, the plague had reached every corner of Europe, and it wasn't done yet. The disease swept across Asia and the Middle East and arrived in North Africa by 1349. From there, it made its way to the Iberian Peninsula and northern Africa. By 1351, the worst of the outbreak was over. But some regions continued to experience outbreaks for years afterwards. And here's one thing that's sometimes forgotten about the Black Death. This wasn't just a European catastrophe. In fact, most of the deaths occurred outside of Europe. For example, China may have lost 25 to 50% of its population. Now let's talk about those who survived. A century after the plague, Europe had regained much of its population. But this recovery would not have been possible without significant changes. In the medieval period, the vast majority of Europeans worked in agriculture, and many of these workers were bound to the land. The Black Death killed so many people that the surviving farmers could demand higher wages and better working conditions. And because there were so few agricultural laborers, some places experienced food shortages, which led to the end of serfdom in some areas. Labor shortages also helped spur the growth of guilds, which were associations of merchants or artisans that set standards for production and prices. Guilds flourished during the Renaissance, which is partly why Brunelleschi's dome was a game changer. His death freed up hundreds of workers to work on other projects. The Black Death also had huge effects on religion. Before the pandemic, the Catholic Church was the dominant religion in Europe. However, people began to question the Church's teachings, especially after they realized that clergy were not immune to the plague. Some blamed Jews for the plague, and this resulted in violent pogroms. Others argued that God had sent the plague as punishment for the Church's corruption. These doubts and divisions weakened the Church, paving the way for the Protestant Reformation. It also contributed to the decline of feudalism, as we talked about in the previous video. Feudalism was a decentralized system of government, in which local lords provided their subjects with protection in exchange for their loyalty. But when the Black Death killed 30 to 50% of Europe's population, the surviving nobles couldn't protect everyone. And so the power of the monarchy increased. In addition, the plague undermined the authority of the nobility. Because there were so few farm laborers, peasants could go to urban centers and become wage laborers. For the first time in their lives, some peasants had the option of leaving the land. And because they had fewer overlords to answer to, their taxes decreased. The Black Death also had effects that we're only discovering today. Recent studies suggest, for example, that the plague permanently altered our immune system. Researchers studied DNA from people who died during the Black Death and compared it with DNA from people who lived before and after the pandemic. It discovered that those who survived the plague had genetic markers associated with stronger immune responses. So now you know why the Black Death matters. But why do people still get it wrong? Let's debunk some common myths. Rats didn't actually cause the Black Death. They were just the main way that it spread. Plague bacteria normally come from wild rodents, but they can infect domestic rats when humans bring them into close contact. When these rats travel, either by ship or by land, they can introduce plague bacteria to new populations. That's what happened during the Black Death. Rats traveling along trade routes carried the bacteria from Asia to Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa. Contrary to popular belief, the Black Death did not start in China. Instead, it emerged in Central Asia. Historians are still trying to determine exactly where, but it definitely wasn't China. Flags with skulls and crossbones don't represent the Black Death. This image is often called a Grim Reaper flag or a pirate flag. It was used long before either of those things. In fact, the skull and crossbones symbol dates back to at least the 15th century. During the Black Death, flags were often used to identify people who had the disease. Red crosses were painted on houses where people were dying, and red crosses were also sewn onto the clothing of victims. This was done so that the victims could be easily identified and avoided. Lastly, people didn't really know what caused the Black Death. There were plenty of theories. Some thought it was punishment from God. Others blamed Jews or foreigners. And some even pointed the finger at women who had recently given birth. But no one knew that the disease was caused by bacteria. This wouldn't be discovered until the mid-19th century, almost 600 years after the Black Death. Today, plague is still found around the world. Most cases occur in rural areas of Africa and the United States. People usually become infected after coming into contact with infected animals. And while the plague is very treatable with antibiotics, it still kills hundreds of people every year. So next time you hear someone say that the Black Death was caused by bad air or evil Jews, you'll know that they're wrong. You'll also know that the plague was more than a European disease. In fact, it was a global catastrophe that forever changed the course of human history.